What's up, everybody? Nate, Startup Nation, episodes 19 and 20. I got an awesome guest today, a good buddy of mine I've known for many years, Grant Tondro. He owns 7 restaurants. A lot of you may know if you're local here to the Urge Gastropubs and a variety of others, which we'll talk about today. On these episodes, we're going to talk about how to open up a restaurant. It's a lot different than other small businesses because the value of that business isn't necessarily the piece of cooking equipment or the building. It's more the operations, which we'll talk about. And then on episode 20, we're going to talk about the fun part of cash management with restaurants. We know each other because of the business we've done in the past. My business services restaurants. I know restaurants operate on a very, very low margin, which is why cash management is absolutely critical to be successful. So episode 19 and 20, Grant, say what's up.
What's going on, guys?
So stay tuned. All right, so Grant, on episode 19 today, we want to talk a little about opening a business. I originally met you, I think, in the very beginning, within the first year of opening Urge Gastropub in Rancho Bernardo.
Right, which is restaurant number 2 for us.
Yeah, and so tell me a little bit about how you open restaurants, why you decided to do it, and just the dynamic in getting enough cash to do that, due to the fact that in the intro there we explained that cash isn't just, banks don't historically just give you money for restaurants because of one, your failure rate, and two, the assets aren't really worth a ton to them. So.
Definitely. It's we opened up. Zach Higson, my best friend since I was 15, and his younger brother Nate and I got our first restaurant open in 2007. And it's definitely difficult to do. I'd written a business plan as part of my master's degree program for an unrelated business. We took that business plan and reworked it for a restaurant. Both Zach and I, as well as Nate, had a pretty extensive history in hospitality at one point or another. Zach and I were running liquor departments for Vaughn's grocery stores, working with big wine and liquor wholesalers. And then Nate was the one of us who was actually working a lot in the restaurant industry at the time for patent officers. So had a business plan. We figured, no idea how to do this. Where do we go from here? So I literally walked into a Wells Fargo branch, and it was the guy's first day as a small business banker. And I had my business plan, and I said, how do I get a loan to start a business? He said, I have no idea, but if you give me an hour, we'll sit here and we'll work the phones and we'll see if we can figure that out.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah, absolutely. So the guy's name was Pat Burke. He was awesome. It's been a couple of years since I've talked to him, but we kept in touch relatively. And thankfully at the time, the SBA program was really tailor-made for true startup restaurants. Now, the tricky part is, you have all this expensive restaurant equipment. So much of the expense of starting a restaurant is your tenant improvement build out, or your TIs. That's something that if you're an established restaurateur, a lot of times landlords will give you credits or give you dollars towards that. But if you're a startup guy, good luck getting any kind of money. Or if you do get some, it'll be enough to do air conditioning and maybe some basic plumbing, but really not enough to get you up off the ground. So the SBA loan was key, just because the SBA can do a relatively healthy amount of money to go ahead and get you up off the ground. The trick with the SBA is you need to have 30% of the cash yourself. So if you do your numbers and you say, all right, to get this restaurant up off the ground is going to cost $500,000, which, by the way, is a really inexpensive restaurant to get started. That better be a second generation restaurant space where you still have a lot of the kitchen equipment left over from the former operator who you can acquire with key money from the landlord. So it's kind of a morbid thing. You're basically trying to build a phoenix out of somebody else's ashes. Yeah. But that's the least expensive way.
That has to be a tough part, right? But it's a restaurant that basically closed down, and you're saying, I'm going to build off of your failures.
Yeah, but that's the cheapest way to get something going. So, but if you have $500,000, your project is, then the SBA is still going to make you come up with and spend $150,000 before any of their money kicks in to do the project, which can be tricky. Yeah, they're not too picky on where that money comes from. They just want to make sure that it's not other loans from other banks. So they're typically saying friends and family money. If you have a home equity line of credit, or things like that, but it can be scary. I mean, when you're doing something with an SBA loan, you're putting it all out on the line. In fact, our first company, the holding company name is Bet the Farm LLC.
Oh,
We
really?
literally had to put up our houses as collateral for it.
That's mine, and we just got a big 7A loan, more for debt consolidation, and I had to put up both houses and everything, and it's still like that, right? And if you want to be an entrepreneur and grow, it's inevitable that's going to happen.
Absolutely. And here we are 12 years later, and literally a month ago, we refinanced out of our 7As. So finally got the
12
leads.
years.
12 years. Yeah, so nice short period of time, 7 restaurants later, and that's how long it took to get out from underneath the 7As. So it's but you got to start somewhere, and if you're committed to it and you think you can make it work, then there's unfortunately not a whole lot of other ways to get things started up from there. So first restaurant started 2007. Thankfully, we were able to do it for a song and a dance. Both my business partner and I, Zach, kept our day jobs in case we had to put more money into the business. Thank God we didn't have to. And then Nate, who had just had his first kid, came back from paternity leave, and I think we paid him $29,000 that first year. Yeah, for like 60 hours a week. And then Zach and I were working nights and weekends. Almost 3 years after we opened it, we started paying ourselves $500 every other week out of it, just to make sure we were in a good spot. So, but second restaurant was when you and I met. Yeah. So we, at that point, we really hit our stride with the first restaurant. We'd been stockpiling cash, and there was another restaurant right next door to the first one where he hadn't been paying his state board of equalization bills. And with that, he ended up putting the restaurant up for sale so that he could settle that. And for those of you that don't know, that's sales tax. This guy owned an unrelated business, and there was some tricky rules with collecting sales tax on refrigerated to-go items versus non-refrigerated to-go items. Basically, when in doubt, collect tax, but there's also good resources to double check that stuff. So the SBOE came and did an audit on his stuff and found out that he owed them about $100,000 in uncollected taxes. It's not like he collected them and didn't pay them. He never even collected them in the first place, but he still owed them. So we were able to buy that restaurant and thought we had enough money saved up to do the second one without having to take on any additional debt. And about halfway through the project, we realized that we did not have enough money. So we got really close to losing everything. That was the first time.
How close, if you don't mind? What does that look like?
So we got down to about $50,000 in the bank accounts, which for most people I know, myself included, $50,000 in my personal bank account is nice and healthy. Yeah. $50,000 in your business bank account, not so healthy. If you're doing $200,000 a month in sales, which is what we were doing with the first restaurant at the time, or close to it, that means that you have about $180,000 a month worth of expenses. So $50,000 is roughly 5 days of cash on hand, yeah. 6 days of cash on hand. That's not good. It's not good. In a perfect world, you want to be north of 20 days of cash on hand as a restaurant at a minimum. So there's plenty of times in the last 12 years we've operated with less than 20 days of cash on hand, but that's a good barometer for you. So thankfully we had a couple of regular customers we'd known for a long time, some local businessmen, and we were able to raise $200,000, $25,000 each from 4 guys, and then $100,000 from a 5th guy to go ahead and get everything built. And got things done, got things open, had 3 or 4 really, really rough months when we first started. Got through it, didn't pay ourselves for a little bit, but then at the end of year 1, we were able to pay those guys back every cent.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So you and I met probably about 3 months into that.
Yeah, I remember that, yeah. So with that being said, I mean, I guess that the grit or the mental fortitude you have to go through those. Talk a little bit about that from opening a business, and you probably still have to have that. I mean, you and I had lunch a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about 12 years in, or 11 years and 8 months, when you're still trying to get the 7A off and all the stress along with raising cash, which we'll talk about in the next episode. Just the importance of maintaining that type of mentality throughout 12 years versus the first 2 years, which a lot of entrepreneurs think after I get through the first couple years, it's the easy road, which isn't necessarily the case. Right?
Definitely. It gets easier, yeah. Don't get me wrong, but the single biggest thing is you really start to understand all of the metrics. Mm-hmm. There's 2 very, very different business skills. One is operating the day-to-day portion of a restaurant, and the other is really understanding there's only a handful of financial mechanisms that will drastically affect, either positively or negatively, how much money you're bringing to the bottom line. The average restaurant nationwide, from all the research I've read, brings about 3.5 cents on the dollar down to the bottom line, which is nothing. And so even if you're doing $100,000 a month in sales, which sounds amazing, congratulations. If you're average, you made $3,500.
You're talking about 3.5% profit, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's not a lot of money left over for an industry that pretty much starts at 50 hours a week and goes up from there. And an industry where you are putting your entire livelihood on the line every single day to build a restaurant, and you may be taking on hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt to do. Congratulations, here's your $3,500.
So, pretty defeating at times.
Yeah, it definitely is. Yeah. Definitely is. So, but you have to be committed to it. If it was easy to be better than average, then everybody would do it.
Absolutely.
But if you take a step back to really understand what the mechanisms are that affect your profitability, it makes everything a whole lot easier. So you've got to, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. That was an old John Wooden one, but it's still classic. And if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. You've got to track your labor, got to track your food cost, got to track your pour cost. And if you can do those three things, and you've negotiated a good, favorable lease up front that has some flexibility worked into it, you're going to be just fine as long as you're measuring. But you have to be committed. You're going to have bad weeks. Things are going to change that are completely out of your control, and you have to have that mental fortitude to be able to fight through it, to stay committed, to stay focused, and do what you got to do.
Don't lose the service side of it. Don't lose the food side of it, right? And focus on the big costs, right? They're the ones that you got to really control. Clearly, you're not going to just spend 10 times more on trash than you should, or things like that. But those three, if you can't control those three, nothing else really matters.
Exactly. Because even if you're overpaying on everything else,
it's a couple percent.
Yeah, exactly. And a couple percent, as opposed to 3.5%, definitely adds up. Yeah. But those three,
or 50, 60%. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And understanding that you need to have connections and resources to make things happen. Understand that nobody ever wants your business to fail, because chances are you owe them money and then they get nothing back. But having that open communication on everything is key. If you do run into financial situations, talk with your vendors, talk with your landlord. Almost everyone will work with you to a certain degree to buy you some more time. When we first opened up Urge, within the first 2 months, sales were nowhere near where we needed them to be. We were doing about $110,000 a month in sales, and pencil-wise, we needed to be closer to 150, 160. And we had this $30,000 bill for all of our plates and glassware and silverware and everything else. And it came due, and of course we needed more plates and more silverware to serve the guests that we had, because we drastically underestimated it. And we didn't have $30,000 to settle the bill so we could get more stuff. So we talked with the vendor about it. We were open and honest, and we said, look, can we figure out a payment plan over the next 6 or 7 months so that we can chip away on this thing, but we need access to more product. And we had to make that first payment as a good faith estimate. I think that first payment went on a credit card, but we had to get them something to show them that we were committed, and they worked with us. Same thing with our major food supplier. Same thing with the landlord. We said, look, can we skip 1 month of rent just to give ourselves some breathing room, and then we'll take that month and we'll amortize it over the next 12 months. So starting next month, we're going to pay you rent, and we're going to give you 1/12 of the month that we missed. So
it's good that you talk about that. I mean, Green Guard goes through that too. We've went through that over the last 6 months, and mind you, we're getting better now. Ours are a little bit different because all of our, unlike restaurants operate a very low margin. We're low margin, but not to that extent. But for us, everybody's on net terms, right? Versus restaurants that aren't, but they have to operate at a much lower margin. So in scenarios where we have a handful of our larger restaurants that don't pay us, for example, our payroll for just Green Guard every week on average is $58,000 to $62,000. So if you have that, and then you have say, instead of a 25% past due, which in our case could be $70,000 to $100,000 in past due, we were currently sitting at like $180,000 past due. So you're talking about a $100,000 swing.
Yeah.
Plus you got to then, and say that $100,000 swings over 30 days. Well, you have a $100,000 swing plus another $240,000 in payroll that you've had to cover. So you're talking a $350,000 swing in a month, right? And and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next episode, but those types of things are where you have to really plan for it, right? Because it can cause you a lot of problems.
Having those financial levers, we call them, are so important. And especially when you're first starting up, which is usually when you need them the most, is when it's hardest to get them. So you got to plan ahead.
So talk a little bit about when you went to the bank, you got this loan with the SBA, you guys probably friends and family and your own savings accounts and everything, right? You kind of emptied that out. Share as much as you want with how that looks. How that conversation goes at home, how you, because a lot of people don't really understand, one, the financial strain and how that can have on a relationship. I've talked about it a lot in my episodes with my wife about how that's, but then also how then the workload along with that financial strain applies to a startup, restaurant.
I'd be lying if I said it wasn't easier doing it when we did because we didn't have kids. My wife and I were married when we opened up the first restaurant. Neither of my business partners were married yet, though one of them had a kid and he was engaged and was in the process of getting ready to get married. But it made it easier because our personal financial commitments weren't strained as much as they would be later in life. I've got 3 kids now and a mortgage and all kinds of other fun stuff that if you have to go a couple months without money coming in, it's
not the end of the world.
Less than ideal, but at the time it wasn't as big of a deal as it would be now. So, I would definitely advocate the same thing with personal life of open communication. Getting that first restaurant going, the Barrel Room, that was a failed Schlotsky's Deli that we ended up taking over. It was actually a restaurant in between called Majolica, which was a Spanish Japanese fusion. Shocking, it didn't work out.
I was going to say that. Trying too hard to reinvent the wheel.
Some ideas pencil, and then others not so much. Yeah, wow. Hey, their loss, our gain. So, but the total project cost for that very first restaurant, and again, this is 2007, was about $330,000. So again, going off that SBA number, that meant that we had to come up with about $100,000 in order to be able to do it. And I think at the time I had like $5,000 in my bank account. Zach had a little bit more money. So it all became, how do we make this happen? Awesome. So we had thought it would cost a whole lot less, and then the more and more we got into it, the more we realized this is where the number was. So first step was honestly applying for a bunch of credit cards that I could either put all of my life expenses on and then save up my own cash so I could come up with my portion of that $100,000, or ideally, honestly, it was, do you have any balance transfer checks? So, and then just write the checks to myself, basically maxing out the credit cards.
That's better than cash advance though, right?
Yeah, it was better than cash advance. Yeah. I mean, it was, only 15% interest as opposed to 30. And then did a home equity line of credit against my house because I knew that once the loan was done, then the SBA would put a lien against it and I wouldn't be able to get a home equity line of credit regardless of how much equity I had. So those handful of things to basically beg, borrow, and steal a little bit of money from my parents, like $7,000 or $8,000. Zach was pretty much in the same boat. He had to do a lot of the same things. And between the two of us, we were basically able to scrape together the money that we needed. And then getting that thing going. And of course, as we're doing it, my wife has seen all the stress that I'm putting myself under trying to hustle my way to come up with $50,000 on my own to make this thing happen. And there were some heated conversations, discussions about all that. There was definitely some tears. It wasn't something that we had to do. And even though I felt like we had to do it for our own future, that's, my wife and I are a good balance to each other. And so she was saying, well, look, we want to build a family, we want to get out of this condo, and we want to get into a house, and are we risking all that stuff to try to make this other thing happen? And she was definitely right. And she made me stop and reflect and consider, and we were definitely a team trying to get that thing going. And I know Zach went through a lot of the same stuff.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I've said this in other podcasts, but I remember, going from, I did similar to Grant where I had Green Guards growing. At the time, actually, we met, he knew I was working in the corporate world, right? And so we had that similar discussion. But you go from making quite a bit of money in the corporate world to basically nothing. I think I went from like $250,000 a year or close to it to $20,000 a year, $30,000 a year, something. And you're like, oh shit, what am I doing, right? Yeah, and my savings went bye-bye, right? But aside from that, the marital strain, even though, because conceptually we're like, I'm going to be gone all the time, I'll do my best. We understand the common goal here, but when it actually happens, it's clearly a different reality. No matter how much you try to prepare for it. And so, I mean, frankly, both of us, I think, gained like 50 plus pounds. It became pretty unhealthy. It didn't get to a point where there's any major issues, but it was one of those things where it definitely put us in a position. But we also, I think, from a longevity standpoint, now look back at it, made us stronger, right? But it was definitely, there's some points where like I wouldn't see her for a week outside of her sleeping in the bed because I would be working 16, 17-hour days and then just come home by the time she's sleeping, right?
Oh, totally. Beth, my wife, was working for Starbucks at the time. She was a store manager. She was with them for 14 years. And then I was a vice president with Washington Mutual Bank for a few years. And so I was at the bank, 9 to 6, Monday through Friday. Sometimes I'd work Saturdays. And then I would close the restaurant Tuesday nights, so I wouldn't get home until 1 o'clock in the morning. And then I would work Saturdays. I would open up the restaurant, so I would get in there 8 a.m., 9 a.m. if I wasn't at the bank, and be there until 6 or 7. And then I would do wine tastings on Sundays. We started doing the wine tastings just because it was an extra $400 to $500 worth of revenue every single week. And I also started doing it, frankly, because I got tips, so at least I was getting something out of the restaurant.
So you had a small business. Remember, and I think I said this in the beginning, Grant is doing over $20 million a year with all his restaurants now. So it's just a far cry from where he is now. But understand where you got to take the ego out of it and realize where he started, and that it's not like he just started with $20 million in revenue. So this is literally where he had to start, and he appreciates that.
Yeah, you cannot be too proud to do anything. I have cleaned the toilets in the restaurants. I've been elbows deep in grease in the restaurants. I've worked the fryers in the restaurants. I mean, I remember just getting absolutely destroyed one night. We were so busy. The sous chef, who's the number 2 in command back there, came out to me and said, "You got to stop seating people. I need to be able to catch up." And of course, he's saying that knowing that he's got 15 tickets in the window and it's going to take him 30 minutes per meal to get stuff out. And I'm looking at our bills coming up and saying, there is no way I'm going to stop seating people right now. Show me how to work the fryer.
This is how we pay our bills.
Yeah, exactly. And getting in there and doing what you got to do. So, and that's just the reality of it. And so those Tuesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays, in addition to the 50-hour-a-week job I already had, was doing that. And then other nights when necessary, which was pretty often those first couple of years in particular. Even just stopping by for an hour after work. Well, first of all, there's no such thing as stopping in for just an hour. No. Because if you're doing it right, 30 people are going to stop you with questions or to say, wow, you guys are doing so great, or congratulate you, or whatever else. And there's a certain amount of glad handing that needs to happen.
4 hours goes by. Yeah.
Oh, exactly. And then next thing you know, it's 10, 11 o'clock. And so my wife was working at 4 a.m. at Starbucks. I'd get home and, all right, I missed her for another day. So it was rough. We couldn't have done it with kids with that first one.
So we just wanted, so for episode 19, we really wanted to give you perspective on, I've had a ton of different guests here, most of them of open businesses, and they have very similar stories, probably not quite as extreme as him. We've had a couple that are more, but the reality is that we had one of the guests that say he actually misses father's funeral because he was opening restaurants at the time. So, and he says he has to live with it, right? And so it's something him and I still talk about it. But people have to unfortunately make decisions. Mind you, he clearly wanted to make a different decision at that point. But the thing is that we have to do what we have to do to get to be successful, because the alternative really doesn't exist in our minds.
Sure. Well, not only that, but I mean, if you choose to do this, you have to 100% understand and embrace the fact that you're putting everything on the line.
Everything.
So putting everything on the line doesn't mean nights and weekends off. It means everything's on the line. So you take the time when you can. You take the time when you can get it. You do need to have some balance in your life, or you're just gonna flame out. But you can't be afraid of hard work, because it's gonna be a lot of hard work no matter what.
And it's going to be for many years to come too, depending on what extent you want to get. One restaurant, clearly it's going to even out. You'll still have hard work, but it's going to be where it is. But for someone like you that has ambition to open 10, 20 of them type of thing, that doesn't just go away. Because when you open up your new location, it's not like all of a sudden you're going to sit back and say, you do this and you do this. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. Never happens that way.
No.
Never happens that way.
And if it does, you're going to put another $100,000 and do it for labor or something, right?
Yeah.
And so.
No, the fastest way to make a small fortune in the restaurant industry is to start with a large one.
Yep.
And if you don't have systems and procedures in place, it doesn't work if it only works when you're there.
And that's the scary part, right? Because if you don't have the right processes and then the right people to be able to execute those processes, you're dead in the water.
Right. But when you have to understand the cold hard truth of owning any kind of business, this isn't unique to restaurants, is there are three final outcomes for any business. One is to just shut it down, which no operator wants to do that, because then there's no cash out event. You close your doors. Two is you hand it off to the next generation. That's awesome, but my oldest kid is 9. I'd rather not be doing this in another 20 years if I can, as much as I like it. Or 3 is you sell it. And look, I have no interest in selling our business anytime soon, so I don't want to sound like I'm doing anything. But you have to understand those are the only 3 options. Yeah. There's no other choice in there, right? So you have to make certain decisions with that end in mind.
Yeah, have an exit strategy, basically.
Yeah,
even day one, that potentially could change, but you still have to be conscious of it, right?
Exactly.
Well, cool. This was episode 19 with Grant. We were talking about how to open a business, some of the struggles with doing that, and the growth of it in the first couple of years, which is we're giggling because it's funny to kind of reminisce about stuff like that.
The struggle is real.
It is. Pay attention to episode 20. We're going to talk a little bit more about cash management, the challenge behind cash, especially in the restaurant industry, but I experience it well too, because being the fact that we service over 2,000 restaurants, I can tell you that we talk to a lot of restaurateurs that have that issue, what he was referring to. And so pay attention, episode 20 coming up. Thanks, Grant, for the episode.
Of course.